The fluorescent lights of Mary's hospital pediatric intensive care unit hummed with a relentless mechanical rhythm that had become the soundtrack to Sarah's nightmare. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, and she hadn't slept in 36 hours. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, but sleep felt like a betrayal, as if closing her eyes for even a moment would somehow make her daughter's suffering worse. In the hospital bed before her lay 3-year-old Emma, her tiny body looking impossibly small beneath the sterile white sheets. Sarah reached out slowly and carefully took her daughter's unbandaged hand, the one small part of Emma that hadn't been touched by the flames. Emma's fingers were warm and slightly damp with perspiration. Even in sleep, the child seemed to be fighting something invisible. Her breathing was shallow and labored, monitored by machines that beeped their steady, reassuring rhythm. Angry red burns crawled up her left arm like some kind of disease, spreading from her wrist to her shoulder. On her left leg, the burns were worse, deeper, more deliberate looking, patterns that seemed almost too uniform to be accidental. The official story, as told by Richard, Sarah's estranged husband, was straightforward and simple. Emma had been staying with him for her court-mandated Tuesday and Thursday overnight visits, a custody arrangement that Sarah had fought against for months. According to Richard, he'd been preparing lunch in his apartment when Emma wandered into the kitchen. He'd turned away for just 5 minutes, he claimed, to answer the phone. In that brief window, he said, Emma had somehow managed to reach up and pull a pot of boiling water down from the stovetop. He'd heard her scream, rushed back, and immediately called 911. The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Everything he said sounded reasonable, responsible even, the story of a caring father facing a terrible accident. But Sarah knew her daughter. 3-year-old Emma was not a climber. She wasn't one of those curious toddlers who needed constant supervision to prevent her from reaching high places. Emma was cautious, almost timid. She clung to her mother's leg in unfamiliar situations. She held Sarah's hand walking through parking lots. The idea that Emma would independently reach up to grab a pot of boiling water, something even most adults avoided, struck Sarah as fundamentally inconsistent with who her daughter was. Then there were the burns themselves. When Dr. Martinez, the burn specialist, had examined Emma's injuries on arrival, his expression had become carefully neutral in that way doctors develop when they were thinking things they couldn't quite say aloud. He'd mentioned to Sarah, in clinical measured tones, that the pattern of the burns was unusual for a typical pulling down water incident. Most accidents like that, he'd explained, resulted in scattered, random burn patterns, splashes and drips where the hot water hit. But Emma's burns showed something different. Defined lines, concentrated areas, patterns that suggested sustained contact with heat rather than a quick splash. When Sarah had pressed him, Dr. Martinez had become uncomfortable. He'd explained that he couldn't make accusations, that medicine wasn't like detective work, that many things could cause various burn patterns. But his eyes had told her what his professional obligations wouldn't let him say. Something about this didn't look accidental. That conversation had happened 16 hours ago, and it had planted a seed in Sarah's mind that had since grown into a twisted vine of suspicion and dread. Richard had never been violent with her, not physically, but there was something about him, a controlling nature and anger that simmered beneath the surface, a way he had of twisting words and situations to serve his narrative. They'd been divorced for 14 months. The separation had been contentious. Richard had fought tooth and nail for custody, claiming Sarah was unstable, that her work schedule was irresponsible, that Emma would be better off with him. He'd hired an expensive lawyer. He'd documented every missed bedtime, every time Sarah had been 10 minutes late for pickup. He'd made their custody battle ugly and exhausting. The court had ultimately sided with Sarah on primary custody. She was Emma's weekday guardian, but Richard had secured overnight visits twice a week. Sarah had reluctantly accepted the arrangement, believing that despite their problems, Richard wouldn't harm their daughter, believing that blood meant something, believing that fatherhood meant something. Now, watching Emma sleep fitfully in a hospital bed, Emma tried to convince herself she was wrong. Maybe it had been an accident. Maybe she was letting her distrust of Richard poison her judgment. Maybe a 3-year-old could and did manage to pull boiling water down on herself. Maybe there were explanations for the patterns in the burns, medical explanations she simply didn't understand. But her gut, that primal maternal instinct that transcended logic, screamed otherwise. The door to Emma's room opened quietly, and a nurse named entered to check the IV line and adjust the pain medication. Was in her 50s, with kind eyes and the capable air of someone who'd seen too much. She'd been assigned to Emma's care since the admission, and Sarah had grown to trust her profoundly. "How are you holding up?" asked softly, her voice the kind of gentle that only made Sarah want to cry harder. "I don't think it was an accident," Sarah whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I think Richard did this. I think he deliberately burned my baby." Paused in her work. She didn't immediately dismiss Sarah or offer platitudes. Instead, she met her eyes with an expression that was both compassionate and carefully neutral. "That's a serious accusation," said finally. "Do you have reason to believe that beyond?" "Beyond what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice rising slightly before she remembered where they were, what her daughter needed. She lowered her voice to an urgent whisper. "Beyond a mother knowing something is wrong, beyond the burns not looking right, beyond the fact that Emma is terrified she won't sleep unless I'm holding her, and she keeps saying 'Daddy hurt' in her nightmares." His expression shifted subtly. "You should tell the police that. Tell them exactly what she's saying." "I did," Sarah said bitterly. "The first officer said kids that young can't be reliable witnesses, that they confuse things, that she might be referring to something else entirely." He seemed almost dismissive. What Sarah didn't say, what she was barely admitting to herself, was that without concrete proof, without Emma being old enough to clearly explain what happened, she was essentially powerless. The police couldn't charge Richard based on her suspicions. The burns could theoretically have been accidental. Her ex-husband had a lawyer on retainer and no criminal history. And Emma, her precious Emma, was too young, too traumatized, too unable to articulate the truth of what had happened. Sarah pulled Emma's small hand closer to her face and closed her eyes, feeling utterly defeated and more afraid than she'd ever been in her life. Detective had been a cop for 23 years, and he'd learned early that not every crime felt like a crime when you first encountered it. Sometimes the most devastating cases looked like accidents, suicides, or unfortunate coincidences until you started pulling threads. And sometimes, after you'd spent months pulling those threads, you ended up with nothing but a pile of loose ends and a closed case file that haunted you at 3 in the morning. Emma's case felt like the ladder from the moment walked into Mary's hospital on Friday morning. The patrol officers had filed a preliminary report classifying the incident as a potential child endangerment case, pending investigation. The burn pattern alone was enough to trigger a Child Protective Services investigation, and the hospital had done the right thing by alerting authorities. But when reviewed the case details in the hospital's small family consultation room, what he found was frustratingly inconclusive. Richard sat across from him in that same room an hour later, the man's demeanor carefully constructed into the appearance of worried compliance. Richard was in his mid-40s, dressed in expensive casual clothes, designer jeans and a silk blend shirt, with the kind of controlled posture that suggested legal coaching. There was a lawyer present too, a sharp-looking woman named who kept her hands folded on the table and her expression professionally neutral. "Walk me through what happened," said, his tone conversational but his eyes carefully observant, looking for the micro-expressions that sometimes betrayed deception. Richard's story came out smooth as rehearsed theater. He'd been making lunch for Emma, chicken nuggets and vegetables, he said, because Emma loved vegetables, was very health-conscious for a 3-year-old. He'd put water on to boil for the vegetables. He'd stepped out of the kitchen to take a phone call from his office about a work emergency, something time-sensitive. He'd left Emma in the living room watching a children's program, told her to stay put, the kind of instruction 3-year-olds sometimes followed. He'd been gone approximately 5 minutes. When he'd heard the scream, he'd immediately run back to the kitchen and found Emma on the floor, crying, her arm and leg blistering. He'd ripped off her clothing, rinsed the burns with cool water from the sink, and called 911 within 3 minutes of discovering her. The paramedics arrived and took over, Richard concluded. I've been cooperating completely. I don't know how she reached the stove. I'd put the pot on a back burner, but children are unpredictable. They climb. They pull things. It's tragic, but it was an accident. Notice that Richard had been detailed and coherent but emotionally controlled. A truly distraught parent might have stumbled over words, might have shown more visible distress. But that was prejudicial thinking, reminded himself. Some people compartmentalized. Some people processed trauma differently. Some people were just naturally composed. Your phone records will confirm the call you took, asked. Absolutely. My company's HR department will verify I was contacted about a personnel issue at 1:17 p.m. Made a note, and neighbors, anyone who might have heard Emma scream. I don't know, Richard said with a slight shrug. I have relatively close neighbors, but I was inside the apartment. The interview went on for another 30 minutes, but Richard never wavered from his story. By the time it was over, had nothing concrete to contradict him. The lawyer stood smoothly, extended a business card, and informed that any further questioning would require a formal appointment coordinated through her office. She suggested that if Richard was going to be considered a suspect rather than a concerned parent cooperating with an investigation, the tone would need to shift, and the lawyer would need to be present for everything. Let them go, knowing he'd gained nothing but a reinforced sense that Richard knew exactly how to operate within the legal system. The next phase of investigation turned out to be a deeper frustration. Drove to Richard's apartment building, a modern complex in the better part of town. He photographed the kitchen, noting that the stovetop was relatively standard height, high enough that a 3-year-old would have to stretch to reach a back burner pot, but not impossible. Children were surprisingly agile, had personally witnessed a 2-year-old extract a cookie from a high cabinet by dragging over a dining chair and climbing. He'd also personally known of a 4-year-old who'd managed to reach a car's door handle while buckled into a car seat, through sheer determination and creative positioning. So it wasn't impossible that Emma had pulled the water down, just unlikely. Security footage was the next logical step, but here hit another dead end. Richard's apartment building had cameras in the common areas, hallways, entrances, parking lot, but not inside individual units. The building's lobby footage from the afternoon in question showed Richard leaving around 12:50 p.m. and returning at 1:25 p.m., which actually aligned with his story. He'd been home during the incident. That wasn't exculpatory or incriminating. It just meant he was where he claimed to be. The hospital had completed its own evaluation. Dr. Martinez, the burn specialist, provided with a detailed report that was simultaneously thorough and maddeningly noncommittal. The burns were consistent with exposure to boiling or near boiling water. The pattern suggested concentrated contact with heat, but could result from various scenarios, including a child pulling down a pot. The bruising patterns on Emma's arm were consistent with grasping a hot object. Dr. Martinez would not, however, state definitively that the injuries were inconsistent with an accidental cause. So could it be accidental? Asked during a phone conversation with the doctor. Technically, yes, Dr. Martinez replied carefully. Is it the most likely scenario for a 3-year-old? I'm not prepared to say, but I cannot definitively state that it wasn't. Hung up more frustrated than before. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Hayes, was blunt when presented the preliminary findings. We don't have enough, she said flatly. This isn't a crime scene. There are no witnesses other than the suspect. The physical evidence is ambiguous. The child is too young to provide coherent testimony. Unless you find something concrete, evidence of intent, eyewitness testimony, prior incidents of abuse, I can't build a case. Right now, this looks exactly like an unfortunate accident." "My gut tells me something's wrong," protested. "Your gut isn't admissible in court," Hayes replied, not unkindly. "Get me something concrete." So tried. He interviewed the neighbors. No one had heard anything unusual that afternoon. He requested Richard's employment records. The work call was confirmed. He pulled Richard's history and found no prior incidents of violence, no complaints, no red flags beyond a contentious divorce. He interviewed Sarah at length, watching her pain and desperation and maternal certainty, wanting to believe her, but understanding that maternal certainty wasn't evidence. Weeks became months. Emma was discharged from the hospital after 2 weeks, placed temporarily with Sarah, but under close observation by Child Protective Services. The agency opened an investigation but found no substantiating evidence of abuse. Richard continued to maintain his innocence, his lawyer ensuring he cooperated just enough to appear helpful but not enough to incriminate himself. By month 3, the case had gone cold. Kept it open, kept checking for new leads, but officially it had stalled. Emma's attacker, if there had been an attacker, had gotten away with it, and had never felt more powerless in his career. The Community Wellness Center occupied a renovated Victorian mansion in the heart of the city, its pale yellow exterior and white trim giving it a deceptively cheerful appearance. Sarah had driven past it 100 times without really seeing it, until Dr., the child psychologist assigned to Emma's case, had strongly recommended the facility's trauma recovery program for young children. "It's not a magic cure," Doctor had said during their first consultation, her dark eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "But children Emma's age sometimes respond better to group therapy than individual sessions. They see other children who experience trauma. They realize they're not alone. And the activities, art, movement, play, they give children tools to express things they can't verbalize yet." Sarah had enrolled Emma immediately, desperate enough to try anything. 3 months had passed since the accident, and Emma was still sleeping badly, still having nightmares, still flinching when unexpected sounds occurred. The burn scars were healing, becoming less angry red and more pale pink, but the emotional scars seemed to run much deeper than the physical ones. This Tuesday morning in early June felt unremarkable as Sarah pulled into the parking lot. Emma sat in her car seat, wearing a light blue sundress with tiny flowers embroidered across the chest, a dress Sarah had chosen specifically because Emma loved it. Hopping the familiar comfort might ease her anxiety about the program. The child stared out the window silently, her thumb working its way toward her mouth, a regression she'd developed since the incident. At 3 years old, Emma had given up thumb-sucking 18 months ago. Now it was back, a visible manifestation of her emotional regression. "We're here, baby," Sarah said gently, unbuckling Emma from her seat. "Remember, we talked about this. You're going to play with other kids and there are going to be some really nice grown-ups there. We're going to have fun." Emma didn't respond. She rarely did anymore unless directly asked a question. Sarah lifted her daughter out of the car seat, settling her on her hip, feeling the slight weight of her. Emma seemed smaller somehow, less substantial, as if trauma was slowly eroding her physical presence. The Community Wellness Center's intake room smelled like lavender, and something else Sarah couldn't quite identify. A friendly woman named Ms. stood at the reception desk, her smile warm and practiced. She took Emma's hand gently, speaking in the kind of soft, careful voice people used around frightened animals. "Emma, I'm so happy you're here today," Ms. said. "We have some really fun activities planned. There's painting and building blocks, and we might go outside if you'd like. Your mommy is going to wait right here, and I'm going to stay with you the whole time. You're going to be safe." Emma looked up at Sarah, her eyes wide and uncertain. Sarah knelt down, fighting the urge to just take her daughter and run, to never let her out of her sight again, to protect her from a world that had proven itself capable of turning trusted people into threats. "You're going to have so much fun," Sarah whispered, kissing Emma's forehead. "I'll be right here, I promise." It took 15 minutes for Emma to release Sarah's hand and follow Ms. down the hallway. Sarah watched until they disappeared around a corner, then settled into a waiting room chair with a magazine she wouldn't read, anxiety thrumming through her veins like a second heartbeat. She'd been sitting there for approximately 20 minutes when she heard it. A commotion outside, the sound of multiple voices, and most distinctively, the unmistakable barking of a dog. Sarah's stomach clenched. Emma was terrified of dogs. Before the accident, Emma hadn't been afraid of much, but there had been an incident 6 months ago when a neighbor's off-leash dog had jumped up at her while they were walking. Emma had screamed, and though the dog was friendly and meant no harm, the experience had lodged itself in Emma's memory. Sarah had been careful ever since to avoid dogs, to give them a wide berth during walks, to reassure Emma that not all dogs would jump. The barking grew louder, then moved past the window. Through the glass, Sarah caught a glimpse of a man in a police uniform and an enormous German shepherd on a leash. A police dog. A community outreach event. Of course. She'd seen something on the community center's bulletin board about this but hadn't registered the timing. Sarah's first instinct was panic. She should find Ms., warn her that Emma was afraid of dogs, request that her daughter be kept away from the demonstration. She stood up, moving toward the hallway when something made her pause. A sound. A sound she hadn't heard in 3 months. Laughter. Pure, unbridled, joyful child's laughter. Sarah's feet stopped moving. She turned back toward the hallway, following the sound like it was a lifeline. She moved quietly, not wanting to intrude, just needing to understand what was happening. At the end of the hallway, visible through an open doorway, was the large activity room. And there was Emma. Her daughter stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by other children, but her attention was entirely fixed on the enormous German shepherd. The dog, a magnificent creature with intelligent amber eyes, was lying on the ground in a perfectly calm position. Emma had moved closer than Sarah would have thought possible, her small hand extended, fingers trembling slightly as she made contact with the dog's head. Officer James Riley stood nearby, his demeanor patient and observant. He was demonstrating something to the gathered children, his voice calm and educational, but Sarah barely heard his words. She was watching her daughter's face. Emma's rigid shoulders had relaxed. Her expression, which had been pinched and anxious for months, had opened into something approaching peace. Her small mouth curved into a genuine smile. She was petting the dog with careful, deliberate strokes, her fear completely transmuted into something resembling wonder. "His name is Duke," Officer Riley was explaining to the children. "And he's very gentle. He knows how to be calm around people, especially around children. When you're scared or sad, sometimes animals can help us feel better. That's because animals don't judge us. They just accept us and love us without expecting anything in return." Emma leaned closer and Duke turned his massive head slightly, his nose moving toward Emma's face. For a moment, Sarah held her breath, but the dog simply sniffed Emma gently, his tail wagging slowly against the ground. Emma giggled, actually giggled, and reached up to touch Duke's long ears. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. It was a small moment, nearly inconsequential in the grand scheme of things. It was just a child petting a dog at a community center. But to Sarah, watching her traumatized daughter experience a genuine moment of joy for the first time in 3 months, it felt like witnessing a miracle. Emma stayed with Duke for the next 10 minutes, asking Officer Riley questions in a voice that was still small but increasingly animated. "Is he nice? Does he bite? What's his favorite food? Can I give him a hug?" The questions tumbled out, words finally flowing from her daughter's mouth in a way they hadn't since before the accident. When Ms. finally announced it was time to rotate activities, Emma actually protested. "No, I want to stay with Duke." Officer Riley smiled, that particular smile adults gave when they recognized they'd witnessed something significant. His eyes moved across the room and locked with Sarah's, standing in the doorway. He gave her a slight nod, as if to say, "I see you. I see that this matters." As the children reluctantly moved away from Duke, Emma turned back one more time, waving goodbye to the dog. And for the first time since her injury, Emma looked like herself again, tentative, still fragile but genuinely present in the world. Sarah made a mental note of Officer Riley's name on the identification badge pinned to his uniform. She had a feeling this chance encounter was going to matter far more than anyone could anticipate. Detective sat across from Assistant District Attorney Hayes in her office, and for once, he wasn't there to deliver disappointing news. Instead, he was holding a photograph, a clear, candid image of Emma smiling while petting Duke, the police dog, at the community center event. Sarah had provided it to him, along with a detailed account of her daughter's transformation in the presence of the animal. "This changes things," said, sliding the photograph across Hayes's cluttered desk. "I spoke with the officer, James Riley. He's willing to work with us. More importantly, Emma is responding to the dog in ways she hasn't responded to anything since the accident. She started talking more. She's having fewer nightmares. There's something about that animal that's unlocking her." Hayes picked up the photograph, studying Emma's face with the careful attention of someone used to reading evidence. She'd been a prosecutor for 15 years and had learned to be skeptical of anything that seemed too convenient, too perfectly constructed. But she also believed in children, in their capacity to tell truth even when that truth was complicated and difficult to extract. "You're thinking we could use the dog in testimony?" Hayes asked carefully. "That's highly irregular." "Highly irregular is better than no testimony at all," countered. "Right now, we have nothing. We have a child too traumatized to articulate what happened, and a suspect with a lawyer and an airtight story. But if this dog can help Emma access her voice..." Hayes set down the photograph and leaned back in her chair. "We'd need expert consultation, child psychology, trauma assessment, everything. The defense will absolutely fight this. They'll claim it's emotional manipulation, that we're using the dog to prejudice the jury in favor of the child. It's going to be ugly." "Worth it?" asked. Hayes met his eyes. "If it gives that little girl a chance at justice, yeah, it's worth it." 2 weeks later, Emma sat in Doctor's private office, a space deliberately designed to feel non-clinical and welcoming. The walls were soft sage green. There were cushions scattered on a low platform that served as a play area. Shelves held books, toys, and art supplies. Doctor herself was a woman in her early 60s, with kind eyes and an air of unflappable calm that Sarah had immediately trusted. "Emma, I want to tell you about something called a courtroom," Doctor began, her voice warm and matter-of-fact. "It's a room where grown-ups go sometimes when they need to figure out what really happened. There's a judge. That's like a very important grown-up who listens to people talk about what happened. And sometimes there are other grown-ups who ask questions." Emma sat on the cushioned platform, her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. She was listening, though her attention occasionally wandered to the toys arranged nearby. "Would I have to go there?" Emma asked quietly. "You might," Doctor said. "And if you do, we're going to practice so you know what to expect. Does that sound okay?" Over the next 3 weeks, Doctor conducted a carefully structured desensitization program. She'd created a miniature courtroom set in her office, a small chair elevated slightly higher than others to represent the witness stand, a larger chair to represent the judge's bench, tables representing where attorneys would sit. She'd invited Sarah to participate in practice sessions, and gradually, Emma began to understand the spatial layout and social dynamics of what a courtroom actually was. "The judge sits here," Doctor would explain, pointing to the elevated chair. "The judge's job is to make sure everyone follows the rules and tells the truth. There's nothing to be scared of. The judge is a helper." "Will the judge hurt me?" Emma asked once, her small face serious. No, sweetheart, the judge's job is to keep you safe. That's the opposite of hurting you. As the weeks progressed, Doctor introduced more complexity. She explained what questions were, why people asked them, and how it was okay to say, "I don't know," if you didn't know an answer. She used dolls and figurines to act out simple scenarios, one doll representing Emma, another representing an adult, showing how conversations between them might happen. Sometimes, Doctor explained gently, the grown-ups in the courtroom will ask you hard questions about things that happened, things that made you sad or scared. When that happens, it's okay to feel sad or scared. You can tell them that. You can say, "This makes me scared." Does that make sense? Emma nodded slowly, processing this information with the gravity of a small child trying to understand an adult world. Then came the discussion of Duke. "Emma," Doctor said carefully, "we've been talking about you maybe going to a courtroom, and we thought maybe Duke, the police dog you love so much, could come with you. Would that make you feel better?" Emma's eyes widened. Duke would come to the court. "If you want him to, yes. He would be there nearby where you could see him. Having someone you love nearby, even if it's a dog, can help us feel braver. Does that sound good?" Emma had clutched her stuffed rabbit. "Duke makes me not scared." "I know he does," Doctor said warmly. "That's exactly why we want him there." Meanwhile, in a different office across town, Richard's attorney was preparing her own strategy. When she'd learned that the prosecution intended to have the child testify, with a police dog present, no less, she'd nearly exploded. "This is highly prejudicial," she told Richard during a strategy meeting. "A 3-year-old child traumatized with a sympathetic animal present. That's designed specifically to manipulate the jury's emotions. We're filing motions to exclude both the child's testimony and the animal. This is unconscionable." She filed her motions the following week, arguing that having the dog present violated Richard's constitutional right to a fair trial, that it was fundamentally prejudicial, that it constituted improper emotional manipulation of the jury. She claimed that the prosecution was using the animal specifically because they lacked evidence, that this was essentially coaching the child to say what they wanted her to say. Judge Robert Harrison, a 40-year veteran of the bench with a reputation for fairness and strict adherence to procedure, scheduled a hearing on the motions. It was here that the case began to transform from a simple investigation into something much larger, a test case about how the legal system could accommodate the most vulnerable witnesses. Hayes presented her argument with careful precision. "Your Honor, the child is experiencing significant trauma that inhibits her ability to communicate. The dog has been shown through psychological evaluation to significantly reduce that child's anxiety and increase her capacity for coherent speech. This is not manipulation, it's accommodation. It's similar to providing an interpreter for someone who speaks a different language, or allowing someone with mobility challenges to use a wheelchair in the courtroom. We're simply providing a tool that allows this child to communicate more effectively." Doctor about her psychological evaluation of Emma, presenting data on trauma responses in young children, and the specific benefits of animal-assisted therapy in reducing anxiety and increasing verbal coherence. Countered aggressively. "Your Honor, this is theater. This is the prosecution using a sympathy-inducing animal to prejudice the jury against my client. The child is too young to testify reliably. Her statements would be inherently suggestible, influenced by the presence of this animal. We cannot allow this." Judge Harrison took the matter under advisement, promising a ruling within 5 days. Those 5 days felt like months to everyone involved. To Sarah, praying for her daughter to finally have her voice heard. To Detective, hoping he'd finally be able to deliver justice. To Doctor, who believed deeply in children's capacity to tell truth. And to Richard, whose confidence that he'd evade consequences began to crack as he realized the system might actually find a way to hold him accountable after all. When Judge Harrison finally issued his ruling, his decision would set a precedent that echoed through courtrooms across the country for years to come. The courtroom of Judge Robert Harrison was packed beyond capacity on a Monday morning in late September. News vans lined the street outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers. Inside, every available seat was occupied. Reporters sat in the gallery, legal observers filled the back rows, and a handful of child advocacy organizations had sent representatives to witness what was being called the most significant child witness accommodation case in recent memory. Sarah arrived at 7:45 a.m., 2 hours before the trial was scheduled to begin. She'd barely slept, spending the night in a state of anxious hypervigilance, checking on Emma repeatedly, making sure her daughter was breathing, that she was still there, still safe. Emma had sensed her mother's anxiety and had woken several times, confused and frightened. At 5:00 a.m., Sarah had given up on sleep entirely and simply held her daughter in the darkness of their bedroom. Emma wore the same lavender dress she'd worn to doctor's office during their practice sessions. The dress had become a kind of talisman, a symbol of safety and preparation. Sarah had braided her daughter's hair carefully, the same way she always did, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. Emma's small face looked even smaller this morning, her dark eyes enormous with fear and incomprehension. "Remember what we talked about," Sarah whispered as they walked through the courthouse corridors. "The place where we practice, the judge, the questions." Emma nodded mutely, her hand gripping Sarah's with the kind of desperate strength that broke her mother's heart. Officer James Riley met them outside the courtroom, Duke on a leash beside him. The German shepherd was immaculately groomed, his coat gleaming, his demeanor calm and alert. When Duke caught sight of Emma, his tail began to wag, and something in the dog's genuine recognition of the child seemed to ease the tension fractionally. Emma released Sarah's hand and moved toward Duke, her fingers finding the dog's soft ears, her breathing slowing as she made contact. "You've got this," Officer Riley said to Emma, his voice warm. "Duke and I are going to be right there with you. You're going to be so brave." Inside the courtroom, Richard sat at the defense table with his attorney. He wore an expensive suit, his expression carefully constructed into something resembling concerned worry, the face of a wrongly accused man confident in his ability to prove his innocence. When he caught sight of Emma entering the courtroom, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression of something anger, fear. Threat that flickered across his face so quickly only detective, watching carefully from his seat in the gallery, caught it. Judge Harrison entered moments later, his black robe seeming to carry the weight of the decision he'd made to allow this unprecedented testimony. He surveyed the courtroom, his expression grave. "I want to make clear to everyone present," he said from his elevated bench, "that we're going to conduct this proceeding with the utmost care and professionalism. This is not a circus. This is a court of law, and we will treat it as such. Any disruption will result in immediate removal from this courtroom and potential contempt charges. Is that understood?" A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the gallery. Emma was called to the stand. She walked forward with Sarah beside her, Officer Riley and Duke following. There was a moment of technical discussion, where exactly Duke should stand, how close to Emma, whether the dog might be distracting. Judge Harrison ultimately ruled that Duke should position himself to Emma's left, close enough that the child could see and touch him if needed, but not so close as to obstruct the view of the jury or the attorneys. The court clerk, a woman named who specialized in child witnesses, approached Emma with gentleness. "Emma, do you understand that you're in a courtroom?" asked. Emma looked up at her, then at Duke, then back at. She nodded. "Can you tell me what a courtroom is?" "It's where grown-ups ask questions," Emma said in a small voice, "and the judge helps keep me safe." Smiled. "That's exactly right. Now, we're going to have you put your hand on this Bible and you're going to promise to tell the truth. Do you know what the truth is? It's when you say what really happened, Emma said. Exactly. Will you promise to tell the truth today? Yes, Emma whispered. The preliminary questions came from Assistant District Attorney Hayes, who approached the stand with careful deliberateness. She began with the easiest, most fundamental questions: Emma's name, her age, where she lived. Questions designed to establish that Emma could communicate, that she understood basic concepts, that she was capable of providing testimony. Emma answered each question, her voice growing gradually slightly more confident with each response. Her hand frequently reached down to touch Duke's head, and each time she did, her shoulders relaxed a fraction. Emma, do you remember a time when you got hurt? Hayes asked gently. Emma's body stiffened. Her hand moved to Duke, gripping the dog's collar. My, she whispered. Can you tell me about where did you get them? Emma's breathing began to accelerate. She looked down at her left arm where the burn scars were still visible, faded but present. It was hot. It hurt so much. I screamed. Who gave you Emma? The courtroom had become utterly silent. Even the reporters seemed to be holding their breath. Judge Harrison leaned slightly forward, watching Emma with careful attention. Emma's small face crumpled. She looked toward her mother in the gallery, and Sarah mouthed, "It's okay, baby. Tell the truth." It was, Emma started, then stopped. Her voice had become very small. It was. Take your time, Hayes said softly. There's no rush. Emma's hand gripped Duke's collar more tightly. The dog, sensing her distress, pressed closer against the witness stand, his large body a physical anchor of safety. Emma, Hayes continued, who gave you Daddy, Emma whispered, so quietly that people in the back of the courtroom had to lean forward to hear. Daddy did it. Richard's attorney immediately stood. Objection. The child is clearly distressed and not capable of providing reliable testimony. Overruled, Judge Harrison said sharply. The child is answering questions. Continue, Ms. Hayes. But Emma was beginning to shut down. Her face had gone pale. She was hyperventilating, her small body shaking. This was exactly what Doctor had warned them might happen, the trauma breaking through, the child being forced to verbalize the truth of what had been done to her. Hayes glanced at Judge Harrison, uncertain whether to continue. The judge was about to call for a recess when something remarkable happened. Duke, reading Emma's distress with the instinctive understanding that had made him an exceptional police dog, turned and placed his massive head directly in Emma's lap. The dog didn't pull away or show stress. Instead, he simply anchored himself to the child, his warm weight and steady presence a physical manifestation of safety. Emma's breathing began to slow. Her hand moved to Duke's head, stroking his ears repeatedly. After nearly a minute, she looked up at Hayes. I'm ready, she said in a voice that was barely audible but unmistakably determined. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom understood that what they were witnessing was not just testimony. It was courage incarnate. A 3-year-old child, traumatized and terrified, choosing to speak truth despite the cost. The stage was being set for the moment that would change everything. Hayes finished her direct examination with careful questions that allowed Emma to describe, in her limited vocabulary, what had happened that afternoon. Emma spoke about hot water, about pain, about screaming. She spoke about being scared and about her arm hurting. The details were fragmented and childlike, but the core truth was unmistakable. Someone had deliberately exposed her to heat. And when asked who, Emma had consistently pointed toward the defendant's table and said, Daddy. Now it was turn. Richard's defense attorney rose with the confidence of someone who'd spent 2 decades dismantling the testimony of witnesses she deemed unreliable. Emma was the most unreliable type of witness. A traumatized child whose memories were likely contaminated, whose language was limited, whose entire testimony could potentially be explained away as the product of coaching or leading questions. approached the stand with a controlled smile, the kind of expression designed to seem friendly while actually conveying subtle threat. "Hello," Emma began. I'm here to ask you some questions, okay? Is that okay with you?" Emma nodded slowly, her hand still gripping Duke's collar. The dog remained perfectly still, his steady presence a counterweight to the sudden shift in the room's energy. "Emma, you love your daddy, don't you?" asked. Emma didn't respond immediately. Her eyes flicked toward Richard, then back to. "Sometimes," Emma finally said quietly. "Sometimes," repeated as if this was significant. "What do you mean sometimes?" "When he's nice, I love him. When he's mean, I don't," Emma said, the words coming out with the brutal honesty only children could deliver. "Tell me about the day you got yours," said. "What were you doing right before you got hurt?" "Watching TV," Emma said. "Daddy was in the kitchen." "What show were you watching?" "I don't remember." "Do you remember what you were wearing?" "My dress, my yellow dress." "What color is your dress now?" asked, gesturing to Emma's lavender outfit. "This is my purple dress," Emma said. "So you have more than one dress?" "Lots of dresses." "And you remember what dress you wore that day?" Emma hesitated. "I think yellow, maybe." Nodded as if this confusion was significant. "You're not entirely sure, are you? Memory is tricky, especially for 3-year-olds. Isn't that right?" "I guess," Emma said, her voice becoming smaller. "Now, Emma, you remember seeing hot water, right? Tell me about that. Do you remember pulling something? Do you remember reaching up?" Emma's breathing had begun to change. She was becoming anxious, her small hands trembling. "I don't know," Emma said. "You don't remember reaching up to get something, even though you might have wanted to see what was up there." "I don't like hot water," Emma said, and there was something in her voice, a defensiveness, a pushback against the insinuation that she'd caused her own injury. "But sometimes kids do things without thinking, don't they?" pressed on. "Sometimes kids touch things they're not supposed to touch. Could that have happened? Could you have reached up and touched something hot?" "No," Emma said, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. "Daddy did it." "Or maybe you did it, and your daddy was trying to help you when he put cold water on you, right? He was trying to make it better." Emma's face crumpled. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. This was the moment Doctor had warned them about, the moment when a child being cross-examined by a skilled attorney could become so confused and traumatized that they began to doubt their own memories, began to accept alternative narratives simply to make the interrogation stop. "I don't know," Emma whispered, and those words, spoken with the uncertainty of a young child being systematically undermined, were exactly what had been working toward reasonable doubt. Sarah stood up in the gallery, unable to remain seated as she watched her daughter being dissected by legal machinery designed to protect the guilty. A bailiff placed a hand on her arm, silencing her wordlessly. Emma was shaking now, her entire body trembling. She'd pulled Duke so close that the dog's head was almost in her lap, the animal seeming to sense that the child he'd bonded with was fragmenting under pressure. Emma continued, moving in for what she believed was the kill stroke. "Isn't it possible that you pulled the water down yourself and your daddy just tried to help? Isn't that what really happened?" Emma's small mouth opened. She looked at Richard, and in that moment something shifted in her expression. The confusion cleared. The doubt evaporated. She looked directly at her father, really looked at him, meeting his eyes, and in that gaze, memory crystallized into absolute certainty. She'd seen that expression before. That particular hardening of his features, that specific anger in his eyes. It was the expression he'd had in the kitchen that day, right before the pain, right before the screaming. Emma turned back toward, and her small voice cut through the courtroom with the clarity of a bell. "You're lying," Emma said. The courtroom rippled with reaction. Judge Harrison raised his hand, silencing the stirrings. "Emma," said, her confidence wavering slightly, "I'm not lying. I'm just trying to understand what happened. Tell me about your daddy. Is your daddy a good man?" Emma's hand released Duke's collar. Slowly, deliberately, the child raised her arm and pointed directly at Richard. "Daddy hurt," she said. "Emma, that's not what we're started," but Judge Harrison interrupted. "The witness has answered the question, counselor." "Daddy hurt," Emma repeated, her voice gaining strength. "Daddy put hot on me. Daddy did it, not me, Daddy." The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. The only sound was Emma's breathing, still rapid, still frightened, but no longer wavering with doubt. Richard's face had gone pale. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, a signal to remain composed, but the damage had been done. Every jury member could see the truth in Emma's eyes, in the unwavering way she was pointing at the man who'd hurt her, in the absolute conviction of a child speaking the only truth she knew with complete certainty. "Daddy hurt," Emma said one final time, quieter now, exhausted by the effort of speaking truth in the face of systematic doubt. "That's true." Her hand dropped and she turned back to Duke, burrowing her face into the dog's neck. Officer Riley, standing to the side, had witnessed the entire exchange, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. Judge Harrison looked at, "Do you have further questions for this witness?" Glanced at Richard, then back at Emma. She could see that any further questioning would only reinforce the child's identification. Continuing would be strategic suicide. "No further questions, Your Honor," said quietly. As Emma was carefully escorted from the witness stand, still clinging to Duke, a palpable shift occurred in the courtroom. The jury members exchanged glances. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversation. Detective, sitting in the back, felt the weight of months of frustration finally lifting. 2 words. That was all it had taken. 2 simple words spoken by a 3-year-old child with nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking them. "Daddy hurt." In those 2 words was the entire truth of what had happened, stripped of legal complexity and distilled to its essential core. And everyone in that courtroom understood, with absolute certainty, that they had just witnessed justice begin to find its way. The prosecution's closing argument was brief and devastating. Hayes stood before the jury with the calm confidence of someone who had just witnessed truth made manifest. "Ladies and of the jury," she began, "you have heard testimony from a 3-year-old child who has nothing to gain by speaking. Emma doesn't understand the intricacies of the legal system. She doesn't understand the difference between truth and fiction in the way adults do. She understands only one thing, what happened to her. And she has told you with absolute clarity what that was. Daddy hurt." Those 2 words contain the entire truth of this case. A man deliberately burned his own daughter, and then attempted to construct an elaborate fiction to escape accountability. You have the power today to tell him that fiction is not acceptable. You have the power to tell a traumatized child that her voice matters, that her truth is seen and believed. I trust you to do the right thing. The defense's closing argument was more complicated. Spent nearly an hour attempting to rehabilitate Richard's narrative, emphasizing the absence of corroborating physical evidence, the suggestibility of young children, the possibility of contaminated memory. She painted Emma as a confused toddler whose testimony had been shaped by leading questions and the emotional manipulation of having a sympathetic dog present. But even as spoke, something fundamental had shifted. The jury wasn't looking at her with the engagement they'd shown during opening statements. They were looking at the empty witness stand where Emma had sat, their faces reflecting the weight of what they'd heard. Judge Harrison's instructions to the jury were meticulous and careful. He explained the burden of proof, the presumption of innocence, the requirement for evidence beyond reasonable doubt. He explained that children's testimony could be considered, but must be evaluated carefully given the child's age and potential for confusion. He explained everything precisely and thoroughly, and then he sent them to deliberate. The jury was sequestered for 6 hours. In the courthouse hallway, Sarah sat with Detective and Hayes, her hands twisted together so tightly her fingers had gone white. Officer Riley sat nearby with Duke, the dog resting his massive head on his paws, seeming to understand that this was a moment of consequence. 6 hours is good, Hayes said, though her voice carried uncertainty. It means they're taking it seriously, considering everything carefully. Or it means they're divided, Sarah said, her voice hollow. Some of them might not believe her. Some of them might think Richard's story is more credible. Sarah said gently, Emma was incredible in there. You saw what happened. That entire courtroom saw what happened. The jury saw it. Sarah wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to believe that the truth would be enough. But she'd learned through this process that truth was often complicated, that systems designed to serve justice frequently failed, that a mother's certainty meant nothing without evidence the legal system deemed acceptable. At 4:47 p.m., the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled again within 15 minutes. Richard was brought in from the holding cell, his composure finally cracking slightly. His attorney placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but even she seemed to sense that something had fundamentally shifted. The jury filed back in, and Sarah watched their faces carefully, searching for signs of mercy or condemnation. The jurors refused to make eye contact with Richard, a signal that prosecutors and defense attorneys alike recognized as significant. The jury foreman, a woman in her 60s named, stood with the verdict forms in her hand. She looked toward the judge. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Harrison asked formally. We have, Your Honor, replied. On the charge of aggravated assault of a minor, how do you find the defendant? The silence that followed was immense and suffocating. Guilty, said clearly. We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears of relief and vindication streamed down her face. Reporters jumped to their feet. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly. Order, I will have order in this courtroom. Richard's face had gone ashen. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but he seemed not to hear. He was staring at the jury, at Sarah, as if trying to comprehend how his carefully constructed narrative had been dismantled by 2 words from a 3-year-old child. As officers moved to take Richard into custody, something broke inside him. The facade of controlled concern evaporated, replaced by raw rage. You lying little bitch, he screamed toward the gallery, toward Emma, who was no longer present but whose absence didn't matter to his fury. You lying fucking bitch, I'll. The officers physically restrained him as he lunged forward. More bailiffs responded. Judge Harrison's gavel came down like thunder. Remove the defendant, he commanded. Get him out of this courtroom. As Richard was dragged away, still screaming obscenities, the courtroom watched. His rage, his loss of control, his true nature finally visible to everyone. It was the exclamation point on Emma's testimony, the final proof that the jury had made the right decision. The sentencing hearing occurred 3 weeks later. Richard was sentenced to 10 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 6 years, depending on psychological evaluation and demonstrated remorse. Judge Harrison's statement was thorough and precise. Mister, you stand convicted of deliberately burning your own child, of causing serious bodily harm to a 3-year-old who was in your care and protection. The evidence demonstrates not only the commission of this crime, but also a pattern of deception and manipulation designed to evade accountability. The fact that you have never expressed genuine remorse, that you continue to maintain an alternative narrative despite a jury's verdict of guilty, indicates a lack of insight into your actions and a potential danger to society. The court sentences you to 10 years imprisonment, to begin immediately. As Richard was led away in handcuffs, Detective finally allowed himself to feel the weight of resolution. It wasn't perfect justice. No 10-year sentence could undo the trauma Emma had endured, but it was accountability. It was the system working, however imperfectly. The case became national news. Legal experts debated its implications. Child advocacy organizations cited it as a landmark moment in recognizing children's testimony. Law schools began teaching it in evidence classes. The New York Times ran a lengthy feature about Emma, the 3-year-old whose 2 words had fundamentally altered the course of justice. Most significantly, Officer Riley's proposal to include trained K-9 units as courtroom accommodations for traumatized child witnesses was formally approved by the state's Judiciary Committee. Within 18 months, 4 states had implemented similar programs. Within 3 years, the practice had spread nationwide. Emma, at 3 years old, had become an inadvertent catalyst for systemic change. Doctor published a paper on trauma-informed testimony procedures that was cited in academic journals worldwide. Hayes was nominated for Prosecutor of the Year. Detective was reassigned to the newly created Child Advocacy Division of his department. And Richard began his sentence in a state penitentiary, where corrections officers and fellow inmates would eventually learn what he'd done, where the nature of his crime would mark him in ways that prison walls alone could not contain. But the real victory, the true measure of justice achieved, was simpler than all of that. It was a 3-year-old girl who could finally sleep without nightmares. It was a mother who could hold her daughter without the weight of uncertainty crushing her. It was a child whose voice, once heard and believed and protected by the system, began the long journey of healing. 2 words. That was all it had taken, and everything had changed. 2 years had passed since Emma pointed at her father in that courtroom and spoke the 2 words that would change everything. On a warm Saturday afternoon in late September, Emma sat in the grass of Riverside Park, watching a butterfly navigate between wildflowers with the absorbed attention only a 5-year-old could muster. Her scars, both physical and emotional, had faded considerably, though traces remained, visible only if you knew where to look. Sarah sat nearby on a blanket, a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. Instead, she watched her daughter with the kind of gratitude that came from having faced the possibility of losing her to trauma and watching her choose, with remarkable resilience, to keep living anyway. Emma's laughter came more easily now. Her nightmares had become rare occurrences rather than nightly terrors. She'd started kindergarten 3 weeks ago and had come home that first day bursting with excitement about her teacher, her classmates, and especially the classroom hamster. "Mommy, look," Emma called, pointing at the butterfly. "It's dancing." "It is dancing," Sarah agreed, smiling, very gracefully. The sound of enthusiastic barking interrupted the moment. Officer James Riley came jogging across the park, Duke on a leash beside him, the German Shepherd's massive frame moving with the controlled energy of a well-trained police dog who'd learned to modulate his enthusiasm around his favorite small human. Emma jumped to her feet and rushed toward the dog. "Duke, Duke, you came." Duke's tail wagged so hard his entire back end swayed. The dog lowered his head, and Emma wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his soft fur. The bond between the child and the animal had only deepened over the past 2 years. Officer Riley had arranged regular visits, sometimes official police demonstrations where Emma would watch Duke work, sometimes casual park outings like this one, where the dog was simply a friend visiting friends. "How's my favorite girl doing?" Officer Riley asked, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. He was in his late 40s now, and the case had affected him profoundly. He'd become an advocate for trauma-informed policing, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the ways law enforcement could better serve vulnerable witnesses. "I'm in kindergarten," Emma announced proudly. "And I have a best friend named Maya, and we like to draw pictures together, and my teacher says I'm very good at listening." "That's wonderful," Riley said genuinely. "You know what? Duke and I have some news too. We got asked to go to 3 different states next month to train other police departments about working with traumatized children. We wouldn't have that opportunity if it wasn't for you, Emma. You showed the whole country how brave kids can be." Emma considered this information with the seriousness of a 5-year-old processing something important. "Because of the courtroom?" she asked. "Because of the courtroom," Riley confirmed. "You helped a lot of people understand how important it is to listen to children." Emma seemed satisfied with this explanation. She returned her attention to Duke, and the dog settled onto the grass beside her, allowing Emma to stroke his ears and tell him about her kindergarten classroom in the detailed, stream of consciousness way young children spoke. 3 blocks away, in a different part of the city, Detective sat in his new office, a space dedicated entirely to child advocacy cases. His walls were covered with photographs of children whose cases he'd worked, including a prominently displayed picture of Emma holding Duke, her smile radiant with joy. The photograph had been taken by a court photographer during a follow-up interview and had somehow become the visual symbol of the case nationwide. Was reviewing files for a new case, another suspected abuse situation, another child too traumatized to communicate clearly. But now, unlike before, he had protocols to follow. He had training in trauma-informed interviewing. He had connections with therapists and psychologists who understood how to work with young witnesses. He had, most importantly, the knowledge that children's voices could be heard and believed, that the system could be made to work for the most vulnerable. The case had transformed him professionally and personally. He'd become something of a celebrity in law enforcement circles, invited to speak at police academies about the importance of listening to children, about the dangers of dismissing a young witness's testimony, about the ways systemic bias could prevent justice from being served. But the transformation went deeper than that. Had to now, and the case had made him of their safety, their voices, their right to be protected. He'd become an advocate not just professionally but in every corner of his life. Hayes, the assistant district attorney, had been promoted to lead a new specialized unit focused on crimes against children. Her office walls were decorated with thank-you notes from victims' families, including a handmade card from Emma, covered in crayon drawings of flowers and butterflies, with the words, "Thank you for helping me," written in careful printing with Sarah's assistance. Hayes had discovered in herself a calling she hadn't known existed before the case. She'd become a passionate voice for reforming how the legal system treated child witnesses, pushing for legislation that would make trauma-informed testimony procedures standard rather than exceptional. 2 of the bills she championed had already passed, and 3 more were in committee. Doctors' research on trauma-informed testimony had become required reading in graduate psychology programs across the country. She'd been invited to speak at international conferences about child resilience and courtroom accommodations. But her proudest achievement in her own estimation was much simpler. Emma, who came to see her every month for a check-in session, had progressed from a traumatized, nearly nonverbal child to a confident, articulate kindergartner who'd begun speaking in her school's class assembly about her experiences. Back in the park, as the afternoon light began to shift toward evening, Sarah watched her daughter play with Duke and Officer Riley. Emma was laughing, genuinely, unself-consciously laughing, in a way that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. The child was still cautious in some ways. She still had moments where unexpected loud noises would make her flinch. She still sometimes struggled with separation anxiety. But these were manageable challenges, the normal developmental hiccups of a child healing. Officer Riley glanced at Sarah and gave her a nod of acknowledgement. There was a kind of silent understanding between them, a shared knowledge of how close they'd all come to this justice failing to materialize, how fragile the thread connecting truth to accountability had been, and how remarkable Emma's courage had made the outcome possible. As the sun began to dip lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Emma ran back to her mother and climbed into her lap. Duke positioned himself beside them, his massive head resting near Emma's legs. Officer Riley sat nearby, and for a moment they were simply 4 beings, One woman, one child, one dog, one officer, existing together in a space of peace and safety and resolution. "Mommy," Emma said, looking up at her mother with complete, unblemished trust, "I'm happy." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, not tears of pain or fear, but tears of gratitude and relief, and the profound joy of witnessing her daughter reclaim her childhood. "I'm happy too, baby," Sarah whispered, kissing the top of Emma's head. "I'm so happy." The Emma case became more than a legal precedent. It became a symbol of what was possible when systems, imperfect, flawed, complicated systems, could be reimagined to serve the most vulnerable. It became a reminder that children's voices mattered, that trauma could be survived, that justice, though slow and difficult, could ultimately be achieved. Emma herself would grow up not remembering most of the trial, not carrying conscious memories of that day in the courtroom. But she would grow up with an unshakable understanding that she had been heard, that telling the truth mattered, that speaking up had power. And somewhere in her bones, in the cells of her being, she would carry forward the legacy of those two words that had changed everything. Years later, when she was older, Emma would ask her mother to tell her the full story. And when Sarah did, Emma would understand in a way that transcended intellectual knowledge that she had been brave, that her voice had mattered, that her two words, simple, true, powerful, had not just saved her own life but had set in motion a cascade of change that would protect countless other children she would never meet. And that, perhaps, was the greatest legacy of all. The end.